Beneath the crumbling stone walls of St. Aurelia's Convent in New Orleans, Louisiana, lies a sealed chapel that has not been opened since 1749. Local historians know why. Inside those walls, investigators once uncovered 23 pages of correspondence that the church tried desperately to erase, letters, describing something so unthinkable that it threatened to fracture the moral foundation of colonial America. Sister Marianne Delacroix, 51 years old, head of the convent's disciplinary council and famed for her unflinching enforcement of chastity, became pregnant. But this was not any ordinary pregnancy. The father was a 17-year-old enslaved boy named Elijah, owned by the convent itself. And Sister Marianne did not hide in shame. She stood before her entire order and declared her condition a miracle, God's own hand made flesh within her. What happened inside that convent challenged every assumption about divine law, and it exposed a network of secrets stretching from the Louisiana plantations to the Archbishop's own residence in New Orleans. For 2.5 centuries, those letters lay buried beneath plaster and silence. New Orleans in 1748 was a paradox. Founded only 30 years earlier as a frontier settlement of faith and commerce, the city had already become a furnace of sin and sanctity, where wealthy merchants traded cotton, sugar, and souls with equal fervor. Along the Mississippi's banks stood stately plantation houses shaded by oaks draped in Spanish moss, while the quarters of the enslaved lay just beyond, mud-floored and airless. Churches and taverns shared the same streets, the sound of hymns often drowned by the laughter spilling from wine shops. St. Aurelia's Convent occupied nearly 4 acres near what would later be known as Chartres Street. Its pale stucco walls glowed white under the Louisiana sun, a beacon of piety for some, a fortress of secrets for others. Established in 1741 by French Ursuline missionaries, the convent served many purposes: spiritual retreat for widows of the elite, boarding school for daughters of plantation owners, and administrative center for the church's growing influence in Louisiana. By 1748, the convent housed 18 nuns, 12 novices, 50 students, and 9 enslaved workers who tended its gardens, cooked its meals, and maintained its walls. Sister Marianne Delacroix had arrived from Quebec 7 years earlier, her reputation preceding her. At 44, she had already served 26 years in religious life, known throughout New France for her absolute discipline and icy devotion. Her letters of commendation described her as incorruptible, a woman untouched by vanity or desire, whose presence alone restored reverence to any room. Mother Superior Jeanne Vaudreuil, who governed St. Aurelia's, had personally requested her transfer. Rumors had circulated that the convent's discipline was eroding. Too many late-night whispers, too much laughter unbecoming of God's brides. Sister Marianne's arrival changed everything. Within months, she instituted strict French monastic regulations, inspection rosters, mandatory confessions 3 times a week, penalties for idle speech. She formed a disciplinary council to investigate even the faintest suspicion of impropriety. The novices learned to fear her footsteps echoing down the marble halls, the way her cold gray eyes seemed to pierce through walls. She rarely spoke more than necessary. Her silence commanded more obedience than sermons ever could. Among the enslaved workers, young Elijah occupied a peculiar role. Purchased 3 years prior from a Charleston auction, he was unlike most others, literate, articulate, and quietly observant. His former owner, a merchant fallen into debt, had taught him to read and write, a dangerous gift in a colony where literacy among the enslaved was nearly forbidden. At St. Aurelia's, this gift made him indispensable. He managed correspondence, catalogued books, copied manuscripts, and assisted in the small library adjoining the chapel. His presence in restricted areas went unnoticed after years of familiarity. He cleaned the chapel at dawn, organized classroom materials by day, and delivered messages through the long stone corridors at dusk. To the nuns, he was a shadow, necessary, silent, and easily ignored. Sister Marianne, of course, noticed him. She noticed everything, yet he posed no concern. In her mind, he was another part of the convent's machinery, an instrument serving divine order. The summer of 1748 brought unbearable heat to the Crescent City. The convent stone walls trapped the humidity, making sleep almost impossible. Night prayers stretched longer as the sisters sought the cool air that came only after sunset. It was during these late hours that some noticed a subtle change. Sister Marianne's prayer schedule, once clockwork in precision, began to shift. For years, she had prayed at fixed times, morning devotion at 4:30, meditation at 6, Mass at 7, and evening prayer at 8. Now she appeared in the chapel at odd hours, 10, 11, sometimes even past midnight. When questioned, she merely said the Holy Spirit had called her to deeper communion, that her body no longer obeyed earthly rhythms. Nobody pressed further. After all, this was Sister Marianne, the living embodiment of discipline itself. The first crack appeared on the morning of October 3rd. Sister Agnes Moreau, a young nun in charge of linens, entered the laundry at dawn and froze. Among the soiled garments lay Sister Marianne's nightdress, marked by unmistakable stains. She recognized them instantly, signs of bleeding, patterned like the beginning of a menstrual flow. But Sister Marianne had not menstruated in 4 years. Everyone in the convent knew this. At 51, her body had long since passed that threshold. Sister Agnes washed the garment 3 times, hung it to dry in secret, and told no one. But the knowledge burned inside her like a fever. 3 weeks later, during morning prayers, Sister Marianne collapsed. The convent gasped. She had never shown weakness, never missed a service, never even complained of hunger or pain. Mother Superior Jeanne ordered her to the infirmary, where Sister Catherine Duval, trained in rudimentary medicine, examined her. What she discovered left her trembling. She examined Sister Marianne once, then twice, unwilling to believe what she found. Finally, she wrote it plainly in the medical log. Patient exhibits all symptoms of early pregnancy. Immediate consultation required. That evening, in the Mother Superior's private chamber, a room heavy with incense and candle wax, 4 people gathered. Mother Jeanne, Sister Catherine, Sister Marianne, and Father Benedict Larocque, the chaplain who had served the convent since its founding. Sister Catherine's voice quivered as she presented her findings. Father Larocque's face turned crimson. "Impossible," he said. "Sister Marianne has lived under vows for 3 decades. There must be another cause. A tumor, perhaps." "I know the difference," Sister Catherine whispered. "She is with child." Mother Jeanne turned toward Sister Marianne, who sat straight-backed, her hands folded in perfect composure. "My child," she said softly, "tell us how this happened." Sister Marianne's reply would haunt them all. "It is not for you to question God's will. He has chosen me as his vessel, just as he once chose the Virgin herself." The silence that followed was suffocating. Father Larocque's fingers tightened on the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. Mother Jeanne felt her heart pounding beneath her habit. Sister Catherine, trembling, crossed herself and whispered something under her breath that sounded more like fear than prayer. "You mean," Father Larocque said at last, "that you believe yourself to have conceived without sin? You claim divine intervention?" Sister Marianne looked directly at him. Her calm unnerved everyone. "I claim only what I know," she said. "I have kept my vows. I have not known a man, and yet I carry life. If the Lord chooses to act through me, who am I to question him?" No one answered. The flames from the candelabrum flickered against the walls, casting distorted shadows across her face. The Mother Superior dismissed them all soon after. Father Larocque would write that night to the Archbishop in New Orleans. The matter, he said, was beyond local discretion. Sister Marianne was confined to her quarters, not as punishment, but to contain the scandal. But the walls of a convent do not hold secrets for long. By morning, every nun and novice knew. By midday, the students were whispering, and by evening, word had slipped into the streets of New Orleans. The story spread faster than any sermon could suppress it. A nun, old enough to be a grandmother, carried a child she called divine. Among the enslaved workers, the news fell like a thunderclap. In the cramped kitchen quarters, Elijah said nothing. He sat alone in the corner, hands clasped, his food untouched. For 3 days he did not eat. Those who shared his quarters heard him weeping softly in the night, a sound that made even the most hardened servants bow their heads. The Archbishop's reply came within a week, a speed that betrayed panic. Sister Marianne was to be examined by 3 physicians, questioned by church authorities, and, if found guilty of violating her vows, immediately expelled and silenced. The instructions were clear: contain the scandal. The physicians arrived one after another, summoned discreetly. Dr. Robert Denham came from New Orleans itself, a man known for his discretion and his debt to the church. Dr. James Pritchard, a respected surgeon from Mobile, arrived 2 days later. The third, Dr. Samuel Whitaker, traveled from Biloxi, reputed for his expertise in women's medicine. They examined Sister Marianne on October 28th in the infirmary. The report they signed together left no ambiguity. The patient is 15 weeks pregnant. The child appears viable. No anomaly or miraculous condition is observed. This is a natural conception. The next morning, an ecclesiastical tribunal convened. The Archbishop, Bishop Marcus Fenwick, presided himself, assisted by Father Thomas Donnelly, a Jesuit known for his unrelenting pursuit of confession. The interrogation lasted 3 days. Sister Marianne's answers never wavered. No, she said, she had not lain with a man. No, she had not broken her vows. She insisted her body was merely the instrument of God's mysterious design. On the 4th day, Father Donnelly changed tactics. He produced the convent's daily logs, meticulous records Sister Marianne herself had instituted, showing her movements within the convent. "Why," he asked, "did you change your prayer hours in June? Why did you request entry to the sealed chapel 17 times between June and September? And why, sister, were you so often alone in the library after curfew?" Her answers came easily at first. "The Holy Spirit called me to deeper prayer," she said. "The library visits were for study on monastic reforms. As for the chapel, I was inspecting its condition for the preservation of relics. But when the bishop asked, 'Do you know a young man named Elijah?' A pause hung in the air, sharp and heavy. For the first time she faltered. Her silence lasted 3 seconds, but everyone noticed. "Yes," she said quietly. "He assists in the library. Why?" "Because," the bishop said, "he has written to us, and he claims to know the truth of your pregnancy." The next day, Elijah was brought before them. He stood trembling, his wrists bound not by iron but by fear. His dark eyes did not rise from the floor. The bishop asked if he understood the gravity of his words. Elijah nodded. Then, in a voice steady from exhaustion, he told his story. He said Sister Marianne had approached him in late May. She told him God had chosen her for a sacred test, to prove that faith could transcend the limits of flesh. She asked him for help in an experiment, one that would demonstrate divine partnership through science. He said she explained that she would conceive without sin, without the touch of man. She showed him pages from medical texts describing methods used by French scholars on animals, ways to transfer life without union. She promised him freedom in return. She even showed him the papers, his manumission, signed and sealed. But the papers, Elijah said, were forged. He discovered it himself weeks later, while sorting records for the Mother Superior. "She lied," he said softly. "She used me." The bishop's hand froze mid-air. The Jesuit stopped writing. Elijah described everything: how she instructed him to deposit his seed into a clean vessel, how she locked herself alone in the chapel to use a glass syringe purchased from a merchant in Charleston. There was no physical contact between them, yet she had orchestrated conception by her own hand. When he finished speaking, silence gripped the room. What he had described was not adultery, not even carnal sin. It was something stranger, more deliberate. A calculated attempt to twist nature itself while maintaining the appearance of purity. "Why confess this now?" Father Donnelly asked finally. "You realize this confession condemns you to death." "Because she lied to me," Elijah said. "She promised me freedom. She gave me false hope. I would rather die telling truth than live under her lie." That night, the bishop ordered Elijah placed under guard in the convent's cellar, not as a prisoner, but for his safety. Word of his involvement had already reached the streets. Crowds had begun forming outside the convent walls. Angry men shouted about blasphemy, about witchcraft, about the corruption of sacred vows. Inside, the church was paralyzed. Technically, Sister Marianne had not broken her vows. No man had touched her. But she had manipulated an enslaved boy, used forbidden scientific methods, and called it faith. What followed would test the Church's authority more than any heresy before. By dawn, the Archbishop had decided, a tribunal would be convened in full. The case of Sister Marianne Delacroix, the nun who claimed divine conception, would be judged not just as scandal, but as potential blasphemy. The tribunal gathered 3 weeks later on November 15, 1748. It was the first ecclesiastical proceeding of its kind in Louisiana. 7 high-ranking clergy arrived from across the colonies, 3 from New Orleans, 2 from Mobile, 1 from Natchez, and 1 Jesuit envoy from Quebec, who'd once served with Marianne in her youth. The setting was the convent's great hall, stripped bare of its students, sealed from the public, the windows boarded and the doors barred from inside. When Sister Marianne entered, the murmurs stopped. Her habit draped loosely over a body now heavy with visible pregnancy. The swell beneath her robes left no doubt. She was nearly 6 months along, yet her posture was regal, her chin lifted. Her hands folded serenely over her abdomen, the presiding authority, Cardinal Sebastian Hartwell of New Orleans, a stern man with deep lines etched across his face, began the proceedings. Sister Marianne Delacroix, he said, you stand accused of heresy, deceit, and violation of sacred vows. Do you understand these charges? I understand, she replied calmly, that you doubt the power of God to act through his servants. Father Donnelly, the Jesuit interrogator, opened with evidence. He presented the syringe she'd purchased, the letters of order from the Charleston merchant, the medical journals found among her belongings, pages copied in Elijah's careful handwriting. He read Elijah's testimony word for word. When he finished, the cardinal asked, "What do you have to say, sister?" Sister Marianne's eyes glimmered in the candlelight. "I have done only what faith required," she said. "I sought not to defile, but to demonstrate. If God gave us knowledge, is it sin to use it? Is it blasphemy to act through the very tools he provided?" The cardinal's voice hardened. "You used science to mimic miracle. And yet," she countered, "what is miracle but nature obeying God's command? When Christ healed with mud, was that not matter-serving spirit? When Moses used his staff, did he not employ a tool? I too used what God created." The tribunal shifted uneasily. She spoke with the precision of a theologian, not the delirium of guilt. Her words carried conviction, intelligence, and something more dangerous, logic. Father Donnelly pressed further. "You deceived a servant of the convent. You promised him freedom. I promised him hope," she said. "And hope, Father, is not deception. You forged manumission papers." "I wrote a prophecy," she said coldly. "If my act had been accepted as divine, the Church would have rewarded him. But faith failed, not mine, yours." The room fell silent again. At last, Cardinal Hartwell's restraint cracked. "You used that boy," he thundered. "You manipulated him into sin, jeopardized his life, endangered this institution. You call that God's work?" Sister Marianne did not flinch. "I call it sacrifice," she said. "Mine and his. Do you think Abraham asked Isaac's permission?" Gasps filled the hall. Her defiance was absolute. The tribunal adjourned for 3 hours. Outside, through the shuttered windows, the sound of shouting drifted from the streets. Angry townsmen, planters, even soldiers demanding the church act swiftly. Rumors had spread that Elijah had defiled the nun. Mobs threatened to storm the convent. When the clergy reconvened, they knew their decision had to serve not truth, but survival. Cardinal Hartwell stood. His voice was grave. "Sister Marianne Delacroix, the tribunal finds you guilty of violating your sacred vows, of deceit, and of conduct unbecoming of your order. You will be stripped of your habit, confined to ecclesiastical custody until the birth of your child, and exiled thereafter. The child will be taken into Catholic guardianship and raised without knowledge of its origins. And the boy?" she asked softly. "Elijah will be sold out of the territory," said Father Donnelly. "For his own protection." "Protection," she echoed bitterly. "You mean erasure?" The cardinal ignored her. "The church will ensure he is kept alive, but far from Louisiana. You will not see him again." For a moment she said nothing. Then she lifted her head and smiled faintly. "Do as you must, but the child will be born. And when people see her, when they see a healthy infant born of a barren woman, they will believe what their eyes tell them. not what your decrees proclaim. That night, guards escorted her from the convent to a modest house on the outskirts of New Orleans. The church rented the residence under a false name, posting 2 sisters to attend her and a doctor to monitor the pregnancy. Dr. Denham visited weekly. He was not a cruel man, curious, perhaps too curious. Each time he examined her, his astonishment grew. Her body, by every medical expectation, should not have sustained a pregnancy. Yet her pulse was steady, her appetite sound, her blood pressure perfect. The child, he wrote in his notes, was vigorous and responsive. In the quiet of her confinement, Sister Marianne wrote constantly, letters, prayers, meditations. The attending nuns, Sister Beatrice and Sister Colette, often found her awake at dawn, pen in hand, candle burned to the base, her sheets scattered with pages of theological reflections. On the evening of February 9, 1749, labor began. The first contraction struck shortly after noon. Dr. Denham was sent for. He arrived before sunset with 3 midwives. The birth would take the entire night. Sister Marianne refused laudanum. "I will feel every pain God allows," she said. Her strength shocked the midwives. She gripped the bedpost through each wave, whispering psalms through clenched teeth. By midnight, the room stank of sweat and candle wax. Her pulse raced. Her breath came in gasps. Dr. Denham feared she might die. He prepared his forceps, but she waved them away. "No steel," she rasped. "Only faith." At 3:17 in the morning, the child emerged. The infant's cry shattered the silence. A piercing wail, then deep, rhythmic breaths. "A girl," said one of the midwives, weeping. "Healthy. Perfect." Dr. Denham checked the child's limbs, her heartbeat, her lungs. Everything was normal, impossibly normal. Sister Marianne watched through half-lidded eyes. When they laid the baby in her arms, something unearthly crossed her face. Not mere joy, not madness, but a strange, radiant peace. She touched the child's cheek, whispered, "You are proof that faith and knowledge are one." Dr. Denham hesitated, then allowed her 12 minutes before the separation order had to be enforced. He knew the church's directive, no bond, no nursing, no names, but he could not bring himself to wrench the child away too soon. When the time came, Sister Beatrice took the infant gently. Sister Marianne pressed her lips to the child's forehead and said, "Whatever they call you, remember, you were not born of shame." Then the door closed, and the room was silent again except for her ragged breath. By morning, the church had already arranged for a wealthy Catholic couple from Virginia, Jonathan and Susanna Redmond, to adopt the newborn. They would register her as their biological daughter, born to them after years of infertility. The baptismal records would be falsified. The name given was Charlotte. Sister Marianne never saw her child again. For weeks after the birth, Sister Marianne lay in near silence. The attendants reported that she ate little, spoke less, and stared for hours at the walls of her small chamber, as if listening for a voice that never came. Her recovery was steady but mechanical, the body mending while the mind refused to follow. Dr. Denham noted in his journal that her physical healing was miraculous. No fever, no infection, no excessive bleeding. Her constitution remains sound, though her spirit seems absent. She lives as one whose soul has gone elsewhere. The convent sisters who attended her whispered that she prayed no more. Her rosary lay untouched beside the bed. When they tried to offer comfort, she only smiled faintly, as though they were children repeating lessons they did not yet understand. One evening, Sister Beatrice found her writing again, hunched over a small table by candlelight. Pages filled with tightly inked lines, every sentence deliberate, as if she feared the loss of a single word. When Beatrice hesitated at the doorway, Marianne looked up and said, "I must leave a record. They will burn it, but perhaps some part will survive." She wrote 3 letters that endured, hidden later by a young priest who could not bear to destroy them. The first was addressed to no one. "They call me sinner," it began, "but I acted out of faith." "What is belief without trial?" Abraham lifted the knife. I lifted knowledge. If faith cannot face the blade of inquiry, then it is not faith at all. God made the laws of nature. I sought only to speak to him through them. The second letter was for Elijah. "I wronged you more deeply than anyone can forgive. I told myself our suffering served a divine purpose, that your bondage would end with my proof of God's power, but I used your hope as tool and offering. You were my partner in faith and I betrayed you. If I could trade my freedom for yours, I would. If grace exists, let it reach you first. The third letter wrestled with doctrine itself. The Church says I sinned because I dared to act. But what are the sacraments if not human acts? Bread lifted, wine poured, water blessed. I use the same materials, the same trust that God works through human hands. If one day science grants barren women the power to conceive, will that be sin or salvation? The answer will depend not on heaven, but on who writes the rules of holiness. Those letters, though never meant for public eyes, revealed the heart of a woman neither entirely saint nor sinner. Her conviction had not dissolved. It had only turned inward, examining itself until it became both faith and self-reproach. By late March, the Church had decided her fate. Bishop Fenwick traveled to New Orleans to deliver it himself. You will be sent north, he told her, to the Monastery of the Sacred Heart in Quebec. There you will take new vows of silence, of solitude, of obedience. You will spend your remaining years in prayer, apart from the world. Officially, you will be recorded as deceased. The woman named Sister Marianne Delacroix will no longer exist. She received the sentence without reaction. Her eyes were hollow but calm. And the child? She asked. The child lives in Virginia, baptized into an honorable family. She will never learn of you. That chapter is closed. Marianne nodded once. Then so am I. On the morning of April 23, 1749, she was escorted aboard the merchant ship Harmony, bound for Boston, and then onward to Quebec. Father Michael O'Brien, the same young priest who would later preserve her letters, accompanied her along with Sister Beatrice. The voyage lasted 6 days to Boston, followed by 3 grueling weeks of travel north through spring storms and half-frozen roads. Sister Beatrice later wrote to the Mother Superior in New Orleans. She scarcely spoke, save for brief prayers in Latin at dawn. Her eyes no longer sought the horizon, but some inner distance none of us could see. She looked as though she'd already gone where we could not follow. When they reached the Monastery of the Sacred Heart, the sisters of that order received her without questions. The rule of perpetual silence suited her. During Vespers, when the choir's voices lifted to the vaulted ceiling, Marianne stood motionless, her lips unmoving. By nightfall, she knelt alone before the crucifix until the candles burned out. No one heard her speak again. Back in Louisiana, the Church moved swiftly to erase the scandal. The official record stated that Sister Marianne had succumbed to illness in 1749. St. Aurelia's continued its work, but its reputation never recovered. Within a decade, enrollment dwindled, donations ceased, and the convent was quietly closed. The property was sold to a merchant family who converted it into storage for sugar and cotton. The small chapel where the secret experiments had taken place was sealed with brick, for structural reasons, according to the deed. Elijah's fate unfolded far from the convent's site. The Church, unwilling to execute him but desperate to hide him, arranged his sale to a merchant in Boston named Isaac Peyton. Elijah arrived there in December 1748, months before the birth of the child, with orders that his identity and connection to the scandal remain hidden. Peyton used him as a clerk, his literacy too valuable to waste. Elijah kept ledgers, copied letters, and slept above the warehouse. For a time it seemed he might disappear quietly into anonymity. But New England's Protestant ministers, already suspicious of the Catholic presence in the colonies, began whispering of papist miracles and blasphemous births. Reverend Jonathan Cole of Boston became obsessed. He preached fiery sermons against Catholic deceit, claiming a dark-skinned accomplice to a fallen nun had been smuggled north under church protection. By March 1749, Cole's followers were knocking on warehouse doors, demanding to see Elijah. Peyton refused, insisting the man was legally his property and guilty of nothing. But mobs seldom honor ownership when fueled by holy outrage. That night, Peyton made his decision. He sent Elijah north on one of his ships, the Providence, bound for Halifax in Nova Scotia, a rough new settlement still carving its place in the wilderness. "It's not freedom," Peyton told him, "but it's safety. They won't follow you there." Elijah left Boston under cover of darkness, carrying only a coat, a Bible, and a satchel of paper and ink. He worked the voyage as a crew assistant, recording inventory. His name entered in the ship's log as indentured hand. When Providence docked 12 days later, he stepped into a world of cold wind, unpaved streets, and temporary wooden houses huddled around the harbor. The merchant who took him in, William Barrett, treated him not unkindly. Halifax, still half military garrison, half frontier, needed literate workers. Elijah managed records, correspondence, and supply orders. Barrett promised him fair treatment and perhaps one day, manumission. It was more mercy than he expected, and he accepted it quietly. Yet the winters in Nova Scotia were cruel. The cold gnawed through the warehouse walls. Food ran short. Illness spread like smoke. Elijah worked until spring, thinner each month, his hands cracked and bleeding from frost. The last mention of him appears in Barrett's ledger from September 1750. Thomas continues in good service. Health poor. After that, no record. Some say he died that winter. Others believe he joined a group of freedmen who later formed a settlement near Preston, Nova Scotia. A faint trace in the colonial archives listing simply Thomas, laborer. Whoever he became, his name vanished from the history books that preferred to forget him. Meanwhile, in Virginia, the baby named Charlotte grew in comfort and ignorance. The Redmonds raised her as their own daughter, tutored her in French and piano, and told her she was a miracle of answered prayer after long barrenness. She never doubted it. Her hair was darker than her mother's, her eyes a deep gray blue neither parent shared. But no one questioned God's generosity too closely. Years later, Charlotte would marry a merchant's son from Philadelphia, bear 4 children, and live a long, serene life surrounded by affection. She never knew that her existence had upended empires of faith and shame. And in a silent convent far to the north, a woman who once called herself God's vessel prayed without words for a child who would never know her name. Charlotte Redmond grew up believing herself the answer to prayer. Her parents, Jonathan and Susanna, spoke often of their decade of waiting, of how God had tested their patience and then rewarded them. Their household in Richmond, Virginia, was comfortable and well respected. Fine furniture imported from London, wide porches shaded by magnolia, servants who moved quietly through the halls. To neighbors, the Redmonds were the picture of gentility and devotion, and Charlotte was their blessing made flesh. She was a curious child, observant beyond her years. Tutors remarked on her calm intelligence, the ease with which she absorbed languages and music. She read the Bible before she turned 8, reciting verses to her father in a voice that startled with its gravity. Yet there was always a distance about her, a quiet melancholy that made even her laughter seem fleeting. Her governess once wrote, "Charlotte is gentle, obedient, and kind, but she asks questions that unsettle the soul." When she was 12, she found her baptismal record tucked inside the family Bible. The date and signatures were proper, but something about the handwriting struck her. Too neat, too deliberate. When she asked her mother, Susanna smiled quickly and said, "The priest had a fine hand, dear. That's all." The answer satisfied her for years, though the unease never quite faded. By 17, she had grown into a poised young woman, dark-haired, taller than most girls of her station. At 19, she married Edward Fitzgerald, the son of a Philadelphia merchant. The union was practical, arranged through mutual acquaintances, but affection grew between them. Edward was steady, industrious, less pious than her parents, but loyal and kind. Together they established a modest household in Philadelphia, where Charlotte bore 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, all of whom survived into adulthood, a rare fortune for that time. Her life unfolded quietly, yet traces of the mystery that began it lingered like a shadow she never saw but somehow felt. In her private letters to her mother, Charlotte sometimes wrote of strange dreams, a woman's voice whispering her name, a feeling of being watched by someone far away, a recurring image of candlelight against stone walls. "I know not what these visions mean," she once wrote, "but they leave me both comforted and sorrowful." Susanna, now aging, always replied with gentle dismissal, "Dreams are no more than wind through the mind, my dearest. Think of your husband, your children, and the blessings God has given." Charlotte obeyed. Yet she sometimes caught herself staring into mirrors, tracing the line of her jaw, the slope of her brow, noticing that her reflection resembled neither parent. At times, she would study her own eyes, gray with a faint ring of blue, and feel an inexplicable ache. She never knew the truth, that her real mother lived and died in silence, hundreds of miles away. Back in Quebec, Sister Marianne's world had shrunk to stone walls and echoing corridors. The monastery of the Sacred Heart practiced absolute silence. Its nuns spoke only through gestures and written notes. Marianne took her place among them like a ghost among ghosts. She prayed when the bells tolled, ate when bread was placed before her, slept when darkness fell. No word passed her lips for years. The abbess who oversaw the monastery, Mother Aimée Rousseau, described her in a single line in the record book, a woman of fervent contemplation, bearing the mark of sorrow beyond confession. In 1763, during the 7 Years' War, British forces occupied Quebec. The Monastery of the Sacred Heart burned that autumn, a casualty of stray cannon fire. Whether Sister Marianne perished in the blaze or had already died of illness is unknown. The church recorded her as deceased that year, though the entry was backdated to 1749 to preserve the official narrative. Her letters might have vanished entirely, had Father Michael O'Brien not hidden them in his personal effects before his own death. They lay forgotten for nearly a century, discovered only when his descendants donated his papers to a Jesuit archive in Montreal. Even then, the letters were catalogued quietly. Without translation, their content considered too controversial for publication. In Louisiana, the convent once called St. Aurelia's slowly crumbled into ruin. After its closure in 1758, the main building served as storage for cotton and indigo, later as a warehouse for rum. The sealed chapel, bricked up to conceal the instruments of Marianne's forbidden experiment, remained untouched. Over time, vines crept across its outer walls, the plaster cracked, and the memory of what had transpired there faded into rumor. By the early 1800s, few remembered the name of the woman who had brought scandal to the church's doorstep. Yet the story refused to die entirely. In the parlors of old New Orleans, whispers persisted of the nun with a child, though the details changed with each telling. Some said she had been seduced by a priest, others that she had been possessed by demons. A few insisted she'd performed dark rituals to conjure life without a man. The truth lay buried under layers of invention, until even scholars dismissed it as myth. Dr. Robert Denham, the physician who had attended her delivery, lived another 20 years after the event. In his private journal, he returned again and again to that night. "I have delivered many infants," he wrote near the end of his life, "but never such as hers." The mother was beyond childbearing years. The conception could not be explained. The birth proceeded with unnatural ease. "I know what I witnessed, yet I do not know what it means. If it was deceit, it was flawless. If miracle, it was undeserved. I will die uncertain." He did, in 1771, 3 days after writing those words. His journal was found among his effects and sealed by the local diocese, marked restricted access. In Virginia, Charlotte's life continued in peace. She raised her children with quiet strength, teaching them charity and humility. She attended church faithfully, contributed to orphanages and schools, and was known for her kindness to the poor. When her husband died in 1806, she managed the household affairs with competence that surprised her sons. Her letters from this period reveal a woman both devout and thoughtful. Her faith tempered by an unspoken understanding that divine order was not always gentle. She died in 1822 at the age of 73, surrounded by her family. Her obituary in the Philadelphia Gazette praised her as a woman of exemplary virtue, whose charity and grace reflected the light of heaven. When her daughter, Eleanor, sorted through her belongings, she found a small cedar box. Inside lay a folded page torn from an old Bible, the passage describing the angel Gabriel's visit to Mary. "How shall this be, seeing I know not a man? For with God nothing shall be impossible." The verses were underlined in a faded, trembling hand. Eleanor never understood why her mother had kept that page. She placed it back into the box and passed it to her own daughter years later. It survived through generations, its meaning forgotten, a relic without context. and so the memory of Sister Marianne Delacroix dissolved into dust and rumor. Her letters scattered in archives, her child's descendants unaware of their strange inheritance. Yet within those forgotten pages and sealed walls remained an unsettling truth, that in colonial America, a woman once dared to blur the boundary between faith and science, claiming the two were never enemies but partners in creation. History, however, had no room for such defiance. The church buried her name, the state erased her actions, and time reduced her to legend. But legends, unlike lies, have a way of surviving, even now, when scholars speak of unexplained births and forbidden knowledge. The name St. Aurelia sometimes emerges from the shadows, whispered with unease. Beneath a warehouse near the old French Quarter, a bricked doorway still stands, sealed since the 18th century. No one remembers what lies behind it, perhaps nothing remains. Or perhaps, buried beneath stone and lime, there still lies the chamber where a nun once defied the heavens, and a child began whose existence the world was never meant to know. More than a century after the scandal had been buried, the city of New Orleans began to modernize. By the 1880s, the old quarter, still laced with narrow streets and French balconies, was being rebuilt in places to accommodate the expanding port. In 1884, during the excavation for a new warehouse near Rue Chartres, workers uncovered a sealed archway hidden behind layers of brick and plaster. The foreman, impatient to keep to his schedule, ordered it opened. Behind the wall lay a small chamber no larger than a bedroom. The air that escaped was dry, tinged with dust and faint incense, as though sealed only decades before. Inside, the workers found relics: a wooden kneeler, fragments of glass vials, a rusted surgical syringe, and the remains of what appeared to be parchment wrapped in oilcloth. Faded Latin inscriptions still clung to the plaster above the altar: Fiat voluntas tua. Thy will be done. The men, unnerved, summoned the parish priest from nearby St. Louis Cathedral. Father Joseph Arsenault arrived within the hour, examined the site, and immediately ordered it sealed again. He instructed the laborers to continue construction elsewhere, promising to report the discovery to the archdiocese. But he did not. Instead, that evening, he returned alone with a lantern and carefully removed the parchments and vials, concealing them beneath his coat. Father Arsenault was a scholar at heart, curious about the city's buried past. Late into the night, he unwrapped the oilcloth in his rectory study and found a packet of papers, 23 pages of correspondence, brittle but legible. The handwriting was that of a woman. The opening line chilled him. To those who seek truth after I am gone, know that faith without reason is fear, and reason without faith is pride. Between them lies creation. The pages that followed told the story of Sister Marianne Delacroix. Her confession, written in precise and sorrowful prose, described everything, from the conception experiment to the church's condemnation and her forced exile. The letters were dated from her final months in New Orleans, ending shortly before her transport to Quebec. Arsenault, realizing what he held, was both awed and terrified. The implications were enormous, if authentic. These letters revealed not only moral scandal, but the earliest known attempt at artificial conception, conducted by a nun under the guise of divine inspiration, a century before science would give it a name. He shared the documents with no one. For months he studied them, verifying names, cross-referencing parish records, searching the archives of St. Louis Cathedral. Every thread led back to the same silence. The convent of St. Aurelia's had been erased from official histories, its land records rewritten under a different name. The birth of Charlotte Redmond was recorded without mention of her origins, and yet the pieces fit too precisely to be dismissed. Father Arsenault, a man of faith and intellect, wrestled with the discovery. In his private diary, he wrote, "If these letters are true, the boundary between miracle and science is thinner than we believe. Was she blasphemer or prophet? Did she sin against God or perceive his method before her time? I do not know, but I feel that to reveal her would unmake more faith than it would restore." In 1886, the yellow fever epidemic swept through New Orleans, claiming thousands, including Arsenault himself. When his belongings were catalogued, the packet of letters was discovered among his books. The archdiocese quietly collected them and, according to internal notes, sent them to Rome for preservation and review. They were never returned. It might have ended there, lost forever, had it not been for a historian named Margaret Lane nearly 80 years later. In 1963, Lane, a doctoral researcher from Tulane University, was studying the role of women in colonial religious institutions when she encountered a single citation in an obscure Jesuit inventory from Montreal, Delacroix Letters, 1749, on deposit from Father M. O'Brien's estate. The description mentioned theological reflections by a female religious of Louisiana origin. Intrigued, Lane requested access to the archive. What she found stunned her. 3 letters in archaic French, signed only M.D., describing in haunting language a divine experiment and a child born of knowledge and grace. They matched perfectly the rumors of St. Aurelia's convent, long dismissed as folklore. Lane spent the next 5 years tracing every fragment. She unearthed Dr. Denham's restricted journal, which still lay sealed in the diocesan archive, and persuaded the church to grant limited access. His entry for February 1749 described a barren woman who bore a child through unorthodox means, and ended with the line, "I am uncertain whether I witnessed sin or miracle." Piece by piece, Lane reconstructed the forbidden story, the nun, the enslaved youth, the conception, the cover-up. She compared baptismal records in Virginia and discovered that Charlotte Redmond's birth date aligned precisely with the timeline of Sister Marianne's pregnancy. The handwriting on Charlotte's baptismal certificate, she noted, was the same as that on Denham's notes. By 1968, her manuscript Faith and Flesh, The Hidden Scandal of St. Aurelia's, was nearly complete. But before publication, she received an unsigned letter advising her to desist. "Some truth serve no one," it read. "The Church remembers, though it does not forgive." She ignored it at first, until her office at Tulane was broken into and her research files ransacked. The letters she had borrowed from Montreal vanished. Lane abandoned the project soon after. She published nothing but a single article in a historical quarterly, referring obliquely to a colonial-era nun whose intellect challenged divine boundaries. In interviews years later, she would say only, "There are stories that remain too dangerous to tell." When she died in 1991, her niece found among her possessions a single envelope labeled "Do Not Destroy." Inside were photocopies of 3 pages from the Delacroix letters, the same ones Father Arsenault had once hidden. The first read, "I did not seek to rival God, but to understand His mercy. If He grants man the seed of life, why must woman be dependent on man's touch to receive it? Perhaps the sin is not in creation, but in the limits men place upon it." The second page bore a short reflection written in the margin. "Should my child live, she will walk among them unknowing." Perhaps that is best. The world is not ready to believe that the divine might also dwell in reason. And the final line, written faintly at the bottom of the 3rd page. "One day, when knowledge and faith no longer fear each other, my name will not be curse, but bridge." Lane's niece donated the copies to the Louisiana Historical Society in 1993, where they remain catalogued as anonymous correspondence circa 18th century. Scholars have debated their authenticity for decades. Some dismiss them as apocryphal, others as evidence of early proto-scientific experimentation by colonial clergy. The Church has never commented officially. Still, the sealed chamber beneath the modern warehouse persists. Few know it exists. Fewer dare to enter. The current owners say strange things happen in that part of the building. Machines stalling without reason, faint candle smells when no one is present, the echo of footsteps on nights when the hall is empty. In 2004, during a brief renovation, a maintenance worker swore he heard a woman humming from behind the old bricks. He described it later to his foreman as soft, like a lullaby, but sad. When they broke through a section of wall to check, they found nothing but dust and plaster. Yet the air, the man said, smelled like church candles. No one has worked that corridor since. Today, the building that stands above what was once St. Aurelia's is an office complex, with a polished marble lobby and humming fluorescent lights. Few of the people who pass through it know that the foundations were laid over a convent. Fewer still have ever heard the name Sister Marianne Delacroix. Only archivists and the occasional graduate student stumble upon her shadow in footnotes or sealed boxes, and even they rarely understand how deep the story runs. In 2012, a young historian named Daniel Mercer began investigating early Catholic settlements along the Mississippi for his doctoral dissertation. While reviewing parish registries in Baton Rouge, he found a curious entry from 1749, infant female delivered under the care of Dr. Denham, to be transferred to Virginia by instruction of the Archdiocese. The name had been scratched out, but beneath the ink blot he could still make out the faint letters Ch-T. Mercer followed the trail back to the New Orleans archives, and then north to Quebec, piecing together fragments long ignored. What he found astonished him. In a sealed folder marked Private Ecclesiastical Inquiry, 1749, Mercer discovered a translated transcript of the tribunal that had judged Sister Marianne. It matched almost word for word the story that Margaret Lane had tried to publish a century earlier. There were even marginal notes in a later hand. Matter resolved. Do not circulate. He copied nothing. Photography was forbidden, but he wrote in his notebook, "The Church knew. They preserved everything." When Mercer presented a paper on his findings at a conference the following year, it drew polite interest and quiet discomfort. A few theologians warned him privately to tread carefully. "There are reasons some archives remain closed," one told him. But the younger generation of scholars pressed him to continue. To them, Sister Marianne represented the hidden intellect of women erased from scientific and religious history alike. That same year, Mercer visited the site of the old convent. The building superintendent, a practical man unmoved by legends, allowed him to tour the basement. The concrete floor sloped downward toward an older section walled off with thick brick. The air was cool and dry. "We don't use that part," the superintendent said. Strange noises sometimes. Tools go missing. Probably rats. Mercer asked if he could see inside. The man shrugged and fetched a crowbar. Together they pried loose a small portion of the mortar, just enough to slip a light through. What they saw was a void of stone and dust, the remnants of an arched ceiling, and, half buried in rubble, a fragment of painted plaster bearing a single Latin word, fiat. Mercer took a photograph, sealed the opening again, and said nothing to anyone for months. The image haunted him. He enlarged it on his computer repeatedly, studying the brushstrokes. The words seemed to shimmer under the lens, as if newly written. Later, while preparing his dissertation, he returned to the Louisiana Historical Society to examine Lane's photocopies. Under ultraviolet light, faint writing appeared on the back of one page, an addition no one had noticed before. It was written in a different hand, rougher, masculine. She asked for forgiveness at the end. I could not grant it. Perhaps God will. It was signed only M.O. Likely Father Michael O'Brien. The annotation suggested that Marianne's final hours had been witnessed, and that her silence might have been broken once, just once, before she died. Mercer included this in his dissertation, which he titled Between Faith and Flesh, The Lost History of Sister Marianne Delacroix. It was published in 2015 by a small academic press. Reviewers called it meticulous, unsettling, and impossible to verify. The church issued no response. Sales were modest. Yet within circles of historians, theologians, and feminists, the book ignited debate. Was Marianne a visionary centuries ahead of her time, or simply a fanatic cloaking blasphemy and reason? Could her act be considered the first documented attempt at artificial conception? Mercer declined interviews. "I am not interested in judging her," he said in his one public statement. "I only wish to restore her voice." 2 years later, he vanished. He was last seen leaving his apartment in New Orleans with a satchel of notes and a camera, telling a colleague he planned to visit the site one more time before writing the sequel. The police found his car parked near the Mississippi levee. His bag lay on the passenger seat. Inside were photocopies of parish records, a flashlight, and a notebook containing a single new entry. "The door is open. He was never found. The building remains sealed. Though tenants occasionally report odd disturbances, whispers in the air vents, the faint smell of myrrh, candles that flicker in rooms without drafts. Maintenance logs note recurring electrical failures near the basement corridor, always in the same section. Each time, contractors repair the wiring, and each time the problem returns. One custodian, a woman named Rosa Diaz, refused to work nights after an incident in 2019. She told co-workers that while cleaning the lower hallway, she heard someone reciting Latin prayers. Thinking a visitor had wandered down, she turned on her flashlight, but the passage was empty. The voice continued softly behind her, repeating the same line over and over, Fiat voluntas tua. She quit the next day. Of course, skeptics dismiss such tales as imagination fed by legend. They point out that old bricks shift, that underground air currents can produce sounds like whispers, that the smell of candles might come from centuries of seeped wax in the mortar. Yet even they admit there is something uncanny about the place. The Delacroix letters remain under lock at the Louisiana Historical Society, too fragile to handle. Only high-resolution scans are available to researchers, and even those are incomplete, 3 pages missing, possibly removed decades ago. On the last surviving page, in delicate ink nearly faded to nothing, Sister Marianne wrote, "If someday a stranger reads these words, know that I did not wish to create scandal. I wish to show that the divine does not dwell in mystery alone. He lives also in the courage to ask how creation happens. And if they buried me for that courage, then let my silence be seed for another mind unafraid." No one knows how she died, or whether her child ever learned the truth. But in the long corridors of faith and history, her story persists like a faint echo, neither wholly condemned nor wholly absolved, suspended between miracle and heresy. Some nights, when the city quiets and the Mississippi hums beyond the levee, locals say the bells of a church that no longer exists can be heard faintly over the water. 1, 2, then 3 slow chimes. And if you stand near the old warehouse and listen closely, they say, you might hear a woman's voice following the final toll, soft, unwavering, and serene. It was never sin. It was understanding. Then the sound fades into the night wind that sweeps through the quarter, carrying with it the scent of wax and river mist, and the memory of a name the world tried to forget. And in that hush, long after the echoes die, something deeper lingers, a question older than any creed, whether faith was ever meant to silence the human desire to know.